Porsche launched the Panamera at the Shanghai Motor Show in 2009, and right from the off really it split opinion like few cars before or since. Divisive styling seemed to offend the purists who responded with levels of vitriol we hadn't seen since the Cayenne was launched. But here's the thing, this is still a Porsche, and that means it's blessed with a almost unique blend of dynamic talents. These things therefore sold in quite reasonable numbers when they were new, and nowadays you can pick them up at specialists and main dealers for £30,000 and upwards. So let's spend a few minutes going through the last 2 years and 34,000 miles with this car, the eHybrid version behind me. We'll go through some of the problems we've had with the car, servicing costs, warranty work, recalls and so on. And then we'll finish up with a drive in the new generation, the 971. This is the 970 of course, and we'll compare the two. So let's start with reliability. Now, whether or not you judge this car as being reliable really depends upon what you require from your daily driver. But the reality is, in the first 18 months of ownership with this car, it wasn't very reliable. It's been fine for the last 6 months, and the problems seem to have gone away for the most part. But in the first 18 months, there was quite a lot going on, more than I'd have expected of the brand, if I'm honest. We had 2 front wheel bearings, an aircon condenser and compressor in separate incidents. We also had a front radiator go as well. We had a replacement door handle for the Porsche entry and drive system. We'll go through the spec later on the rear. A new driver's switch pack in the door panel, and there were various other little bits and bobs as well. The engine oil level would seem to move around a little bit, quite bizarre really. We'll get into that later on. There was also an oxygen sensor in the exhaust, and a cylinder coil needed to be replaced, both of those to cure an EML light in the dashboard. So there was all this stuff kind of ongoing, but the main issue actually, whilst all of this was sort of bubbling away, was the hybrid system. And in the end, Porsche had to replace the actual hybrid system motor, which is located between the gearbox and the engine. So the drivetrain was dismantled, the old motor removed, new one put in, the whole lot stitched back together again, and the car returned to us after about a month. And what you would get would be a red generator fault light in the dashboard instrument cluster. And prior to that, they tried to fix the problem by replacing the control module for the hybrid system, and that didn't work. And yeah, in the end, the actual motor needed to be replaced. Now, what I would say is this: do not buy one of these cars without a warranty, and preferably a Porsche approved warranty from a dealer, which is absolutely bomb-proof. It seems to be pretty much no quibble, actually, in our experience. The warranty on these cars even covers things like light bulbs. The rear wiper is covered on this one, bizarrely, as that sounds. You might have heard it a moment or two ago. The wiper seems to make a vibrating noise as the mechanism wears, and that seems to have been repaired under warranty as well. So yeah, the bomb-proof Porsche warranty is an absolute must with these cars. So the first 18 months, there were, sort of ongoing issues really. The main dealers that we've dealt with for the repairs have been absolutely fine. That's Porsche Swindon, also Porsche Reading very briefly, just because it's a bit further from Swindon from where we are here in West Oxfordshire. And they've been fantastic. But we had a few more issues than I'd expect from the brand in that first 18-month period. The rest of the car fundamentally is pretty secure, pretty sound actually. I've heard people complain about air suspension units on these cars. This one's been absolutely fine, no problems whatsoever. In fact, the chassis in general, in terms of bushings and the suspension system overall, has been pretty solid, no issues whatsoever. It's worth mentioning perhaps things like brake wear. In terms of an ownership review, this car's done just over 70,000 miles. The front brakes were replaced at 38,000 mile mileage. They're slightly lipped now, but nothing drastic. They'll be fine for a long time yet. The rears, I think, will need to be done. at some point fairly soon. There's a lip on those, and the pads are wearing. But yeah, it's 70,000 miles plus, so you've got to expect that. But of course, this is the hybrid version, and again, maybe we'll get into the system later on a little bit. But with a hybrid, obviously, when you back off the throttle, you're not actually using the brakes necessarily. If you manage to judge it, the battery charge gauge to the left of the rev counter will the needle drops into the green zone, which means you're charging the battery. The regen effect slows the car down. It's not until you press the brake pedal a little harder, the needle drops into the grey zone, and your actual mechanical brakes come into play. All the while, of course, your brake lights are on. But yeah, it's just a good thing about the hybrid system. You're not necessarily always using your brakes when you slow down. So yeah, the chassis in general has been pretty good. All the electronics work. Again, I hear complaints from some owners that they've had problems with the PCM sat-nav system. I know the later car has issues with that. It may be the case that the media's getting a little confused, possibly. I've not come across issues with the 970 generation PCM. I mentioned the Spec earlier. This car was quite a nice specification when I found it on a Porsche online website, for the approved, I should say, online website. The carbon trim in here is very smart. Does nothing, of course, for weight saving or structural benefits. That's why you'd normally have carbon fibre. It's just it's interior trinkets really, but it looks better than the standard plastic black piano trim, which is a nightmare to keep clean and scratches really easily. It's worth noting that this trim can actually, or used to be the case anyway, this is about a year ago when I last looked, but this trim is actually retrofittable, so to speak, at a Porsche dealer. And Porsche are one of the few manufacturers that I've come across who offer new car options as dealer fit, retrofit capability on a pre-owned car. Another example is the light system. This one's got the Porsche dynamic light system, which rotates in the bends, but it's not the plus system, which automatically dips and lowers main beam for oncoming traffic. You can have that retrofitted as well, or again, you used to be able to. It's not cheap. It's about £3,000 to £3,500, but you can have that. Continuing with the spec, outside the car we have the 20-inch Panamera Sport alloys. Those were actually black when I had the car. I had them resprayed silver. The look changes when you do that. It's mostly because I don't like black wheels when they're anything other than spotlessly clean. They show the dirt up quite badly when the base colour is already so dark. So I had those done by Porsche in GT silver. We have the Sport design side sills, which just adds to the look a little bit. Rest of the specification coming inside the car, we have the tilt slide glass sunroof, the 14-way with memory power adjustment seats, including the steering column, and the steering wheel is seated as well, incidentally, half carbon, half leather. But on the seats specifically, the standard seats are okay, they're nothing special. The extra charge seats on top of these, which you get as standard in the GTS and the Turbo, I find them quite uncomfortable personally. Not so much the extra bolstering across the shoulders, but the ribbing on the seat base. It's not the most comfortable platform to sit on. The Alcantara effect in the GTS is better in that regard than the leather in the Turbo, but that might just be my particular posterior being quite picky. We have heated rear seats, which get used quite a lot. We also have a Wi-Fi access point, which doesn't get used at all. I've not used it at all in the last 2 years. We've, even out here in the wilds of Oxfordshire, we get quite good 4G signal, so why you'd need that in the car, I might be missing something, but I really don't see the point. Elsewhere, we have the Bluetooth handset in here, which I think from memory cost £1,000 when the car was new, which is just horrendous. £250 for the rear wiper I mentioned a bit earlier from memory. Also £250 paid for the centre of the wheels to be in the Porsche crest. Yeah, Porsche's pricing for options I think is well known. We have the leather door tops, the leather dashboard as well. All told, the spec on this car was about £100,000 when it was new. I mentioned the Porsche entry and drive system as well a little while ago. That's quite a handy feature, denoted by the little chromium strips on top of the door handles, and more relevantly, because I use it every day of the week, in the boot there's the button to close the boot, and on the right hand side, as per most cars of course, there's a button to lock it after it closes. and I use that when I get to the office each morning. It's just really, really convenient. So yeah, the spec on this car really sold it to me. Ideally, I'd have preferred, and again, this is retrofit, but I really haven't been bothered to get it done since I bought the car, the sport wheel with the down for the left for down, right for up, paddle shift gearbox. I've not actually found this one that onerous to use, but I do prefer sort of the more traditional approach, as we'll get into later on when we drive the new car. So yeah, in terms of specification, that's pretty much it. Items this car doesn't have, which you might want to look for if you're looking to buy one of these. We don't have the ventilated seats in here, nor do we have the massaging seats. I'm not particularly concerned with those, to be honest. The dynamic light system plus I mentioned, I'd like to have that. I just find it a real boon on dark roads, or unfamiliar roads anyway. We don't have the radar guided cruise control in this car also, and in fact any kind of driver aids. Now in the 970 generation, in my opinion, the only one of those you miss, driver aids I mean, if your car doesn't have it, is the blind spot monitor with the indicator in the rear view mirror. The cruise control, the adaptive cruise control, is an absolute nightmare to use on these cars in my view. It's for always braking. The new car, as we'll again discover later on, is much better in that regard, and I would have it on the new car. But in the old car, this 970, if your car doesn't have it, you're not missing very much in my view. In terms of recalls, there's been one or two you may care to know about. The first one I can remember, first one I can recall, so to speak, is the oil level. There was a recall in 2018 from memory, where the maximum capacity of the sump was reduced by 1/4 of a litre, and then Porsche affixed on the right hand side of the engine, as you look at the car with the bonnet up from the front, a sticker to the top of the cylinder block from memory, or the cam cover, which mentions the max capacity of the old sump. It might be 6 1/4 litres, I think. They did that after I'd reported, at least from my perspective of course, yeah, the oil level moving around seemingly. It was always going down over the course of several months. I realise that now, but at the time it would go up and down. The electronic gauge in the dashboard never seemed to be the same level 2 days running. And Porsche told me, and this is relevant, that these cars deposit unburnt petrol, because obviously the fuel system is primed as a hybrid car to kick the engine into life at a moment's notice, in a nanosecond if you will. So the fuel system is always primed, and they hold fuel in the direct injection system. And if that fuel's not used, obviously there's a risk it'll degrade, so it's dropped into the sump. Now, petrol was a solvent last time I looked, so yeah, I found that quite interesting. I don't think there's no suggestion that there's anything wrong with the engines, and the engine in this car, other than that cylinder coil I mentioned, has been absolutely fine. Still pulls really strong, really cleanly. I just found it an interesting fact that they announced, and then shortly afterwards my car was returned to me with a sticker on the engine. Other recall work has been around the air conditioning system, at least the recalls that I'm aware of anyway, of course. There was a relay problem which was fixed by a recall, and the aircon in these cars, it's okay, it's powerful in the summer months, you can freeze to death in here, but the winter months as we are today, it's not too bad now looking around quickly, but they do have a tendency to mist up, regardless of air force, strength and options you have in the myriad aircon settings you get in Porsches nowadays. Some modern Porsches I've driven, well, modern being, the last year or so of manufacturers, seem to have the same problem. So it's either me doing something stupidly, drastically wrong, or it's just the fact that aircon in Porsches doesn't seem to be all that clever. With regards to the hybrid system, and again, we'll get into this later on when we drive the new one, the hybrid system in the 970 is its biggest compromise, and I'll explain why later on. But what I do want to mention is, in terms of reliability, other than that motor problem, which was, it was a pain, but the actual core hybrid system is, I think, quite well made. Yeah, this car's done 70-odd thousand miles. When it was new, from memory, Porsche rated the battery at 21 miles worth of electric range. Now, in the summer, this car will still give me 19 miles, which I think is pretty good in terms of what the battery has evidently lost in terms of capability, in the last 70-odd thousand miles and 5 years worth of usage. I don't plug this car in each night anymore. When I did, I was getting high 30s to low 40s. Nowadays I get high 20s to low 30s, and in the last 1,758 miles, this one's averaged 26.5 mpg. That figure is running around town, country roads, motorways. It's back and forth to family in Suffolk. It's back and forth to South family in South Wales. There's a lot of motorway work, M40, M4, M25, M11. So it's fairly indicative, I think, of normal usage. In terms of other costs and servicing costs specifically, we've paid something like £400 for an oil service. These are all main dealer prices, incidentally, for an oil service on this car. Minor, major servicing combinations of around about £1,000 will cover it. Tyres obviously are a major expense. If, like me, you believe in having proper tyres on your car, regardless of its age or value. Tyres for these, this is on Continental Sport Contacts, or about £1,000 a set, £250 a corner. The wear rate I find quite interesting. This one went through a set of rears in 20,000 miles, and again, it's 2.1 tons, so big car, big bills. That has to be the starting point. However, I don't drive like a loon, of course, especially in this weather, but I don't think 20,000 miles for a set of rears in a car of this size is too shabby. In terms of driving the car, dynamics and so on, we'll get into the dynamics later on when we drive the new one. What I would say is this: these are fantastic cars in which to cover long distance. They are very refined. You might hear a lot of background noise right now. This tarmac out here in West Oxfordshire, actually Gloucestershire now, is quite coarse. And again, the tyres are 295s on the rear and I think 255s on 20s all around on the front. So there's a lot of rubber on the road. But it's very refined. It's long distance. It's pretty impressive. 2.1 tons means the car is just pinned to the tarmac. You don't get affected by crosswinds. You don't get affected or impacted at all by standing water, in my experience. It is very, very good. Perhaps more relevantly, there's loads of space in here. These are big cars on UK roads. A very wide track and a long wheelbase means there's a lot of room, translates to a lot of interior space across the shoulders, etc. Lots of oddman space in here. The boot could possibly do with being a little bit bigger, if not in the width and the length, certainly the depth. The batteries live under the boot floor, so it robs you a little bit of space. It does also give you some benefits, though, in other areas. Somewhat bizarrely, perhaps, the batteries tend to pin the rear of the car to the deck in bad weather, as I mentioned, but also in the snow. This car's quite good in the snow, I find. One other piece of spec we have in this car is the Sports Chrono pack, the Sports Plus mode down here. I'll also quickly mention the air suspension, which is standard on these. But the Sports Chrono pack we have on this, this gives you the Sports Plus mode and this rather natty stopwatch type affair on the dashboard, which I never use as a clock. I've never used a stopwatch function. You'll see and hear and read people saying that as Porsche owners, and in a Panamera at least, and definitely Macans and Cayennes and so on. The idea of a stopwatch for a lap timing function is slightly bizarre, but it looks nice. At least, but yes, I've never used it. Sports Plus I do use all the time. As we mentioned later on, the ride quality in Sports Plus can sometimes be a little challenging, shall we say, but as a function to really set the car up for sort of maximum attack, it does work. I mentioned the economy a little while earlier, and it's worth mentioning in terms of what that equates to as costs. So we pay something like £80 to £90 at current rates here in the UK. This is December 2019 to fill a car up on 95 RON and leaded, and that'll get us 480 to 520 miles on a tank full of fuel before you need to start thinking about pulling over and filling it up. And that kind of range is quite convenient, in terms of touring ability and so on. We've been to Paris and back in this car. We've been to Dundee and back. We've been to Brussels and back. And you can do most of these places in one hit. One point to consider buying a Panamera you may not have thought about, because I didn't before I bought this one. You get a lot of attention driving these cars. This one is black. When it's clean, it really does stand out. Again, these are really big vehicles on UK roads. very wide and very, very long. So they're imposing partly just through the sheer size of the thing. You wouldn't really call them beautiful. We'll get into the looks later when we drive the new one, but yeah, these things do stand out. So if you're a shrinking violet, don't buy a Panamera, because they really do stand out quite a lot. All the children seem to know what it is. To be fair, a good deal of the parents seem to be quite aware of it as well. So that covers life the last 2 years with this particular car. There was a point in proceedings where I wasn't sure I'd want another one, given some of the problems that we had. They just seem to be slightly more frequent and less easily resolved than cars I had previously. BMWs, for the most part, for the last 17 years, or I should say the previous 17 years. All cars have problems, of course. I doubt there's a car on the road that doesn't have a particular issue, and I can recall spending time in independent specialists back in the day, fitting new Vanos pumps to my M5 BMWs until the wee small hours of the morning. So yeah, all cars have issues, but this one did seem to have a few more than I'd have liked. However, looking back, you do think, okay, well, it wasn't necessarily that bad. Porsche have been very, very good with regards to understanding the impact, the inconvenience, and so on. The dealers, the ones I've dealt with down south, have been absolutely fantastic. No complaints there whatsoever. So yes, I'm looking at another one. Part of the reason why I'm driving the new one, you'll see in a few moments, is because I'm thinking of changing this for the new car. I love the new car's interior. The hybrid system especially is less compromised than this. So I think with all that said, we've gone through all the ownership and the costs and so on. What we'll do now is we'll step into the new car and we'll see how they compare. So another day and another car, and the new Panamera, the 971, and yeah, straight away it's very different, but also at the same time oddly familiar. The interior architecture is very similar to my old car. High sides to the doors, a high dashboard, a rising central tunnel, and then a vertical fascia to the sat-nav, but that's where the similarities end, really. But maybe we'll start actually with the exterior styling, and we'll come to the interior in a little while. The 970, when it was launched, really split opinion. I don't think anybody would argue with that fact. The design was a bit bulbous, maybe, lots of metal in the rear of the car, and quite a Marmite design in many ways. The new one actually at the front isn't quite as nice, to my eyes anyway. The bonnet and the wing line is a bit flatter than the 970, but overall you'd have to say the 971, and especially at the rear, is a far better resolved design, much more successful. And then we come to the interior. Now, as I mentioned, it feels kind of home from home. It's very definitely a Panamera, and these cars' interiors in general are very welcoming places to be. They're very good long distance, very comfortable, very calming, very relaxing over a long haul. But the new one really ramps things up. There's loads of technology in here. We even have a head-up display in Porsches nowadays. I don't think the head-up display was available when this generation, the 971, was new in 2017. But it's a very welcome addition. It's a very big system, actually. It's kind of similar to BMW's new head-up display in terms of the width and the height and the technology and the functionality, I should say, that it offers up. But the rest of the interior is a massive leap on from the old car. So we have a sat-nav screen which is more than twice the width of the old cars, 12 plus inches, very clear, crisp graphics and fantastic resolution. It really is a very major selling point in terms of the design interior, the design of the inside, I should say, the interior over the old car. Then, of course, we have these haptic panel feedback controls either side of the gear shifter. These have really split opinion as design advances. I'm not sure that I really like them, and not because of the whole OCD fingerprint business, they just seem not quite as easy to interact with on the move. They take your attention away from driving. Physical buttons to me are easier, safer, less demanding of your attention, less distracting to actually locate the function you want, but it's the way the industry is going. In some ways, I actually prefer the new Macan that I drove a short while ago. That had the new widescreen sat-nav, but still the physical buttons on the transmission tunnel. So all this combined means you've got a very highly advanced interior. You have digital displays either side of the analog rev counter, trip computer, G-force readings, tyre pressure monitoring on the one side, and then active cruise and an odometer on the left-hand side of the analog rev counter. Similar 5-dial display through the steering wheel. So it's all very familiar as a Porsche owner and Porsche driver, but it's advanced. It's thoroughly well advanced over the old car. Elsewhere in the interior, it's again kind of home from home. The seats are very good, extremely comfortable. We have the 14-way power adjustment with memory in this particular car. A Panamera 4 eHybrid, of course, hence the comparison. We also have the black piano trim, which to me just looks a bit like plastic. I'm not terribly keen on it. Plus, in this one, we have the panoramic glass sunroof with the 2 panels, which is, I wouldn't say it's mandatory nowadays, but it really does help in terms of the light it brings into the interior. We have the open style steering wheel, the 918 Spider, I believe they call it, style steering wheel, which I actually really like. I prefer the paddles to the push me pull you approach in the old car. You kind of get used to that car's way of changing gear, but it's always amusing to me how quickly I default into left for down and right for up when I drive anything with what I would call a normal paddle shift gearbox. This car, being the eHybrid with a sports chrono pack, also has the drive mode selector switch on the steering wheel, what Ferrari call a Manettino, of course. Drive mode selector for Porsche, and this is actually a real benefit. It's a boon, this particular switch. You can really switch between your driving modes incredibly easily, whereas in the old car, kind of ironically, you're trying to fumble with those buttons trying to find the function you want. But of course, again, it's a physical switch in the 971. It's not down here on this haptic panel, which is an interesting comparison to make. This one also has, as I mentioned, the sports chrono. It's got the sports chrono clock on the dashboard. The new one seems quite large compared to the old one. It seems to protrude out of the dashboard quite a long way. The old car's clock is more recessed into the top of the dashboard and seems to stand out a little less as a consequence. Plus, the design of the old one, to my eyes, is actually nicer. The new one looks a little plain, but yeah, overall, it's a lovely interior, a fantastic place to spend a lot of time. So dynamically then, there are some key differences between the old car and the new car, and we'll start with the brakes. And this is a well-timed roundabout coming up here. So in the old car, as you draw to a standstill, the gearbox will invariably shift from second into first, no matter really what you do with the controls, and you'll end up shooting forward by a foot or two just when you feel you're about to draw to a standstill in it. It's not the ideal situation for making kind of smooth progress, really. The new car is far better. Both cars have epic brakes in terms of their ultimate stopping power. Even my car on 69,000 miles, its brakes are very, very impressive. And the new car is no different in that regard, but its low speed response and the ability to modulate the brakes and really bleed off the brake pressure as you come to a standstill is far better than the old car, and it just seems less compromised somehow by the regen effect in the hybrid drivetrain. So yeah, the brakes on the new car, far, far better. It also makes a far better noise than the old car. The Audi sourced supercharged 3-litre V6 in that car, it burbles a little bit at lower RPM, but at higher revolutions, higher crank speeds, it doesn't sound like it's enjoying it very much. Above about 4,000 RPM, it can sound a little strained and quite harsh, really. The new car is far better across the rev range. Still burbles a tad at lower crank speeds, but then it's very sweeter spinning at higher RPM. and overall it just sounds a lot happier about proceedings. Interestingly, in this one, most of the noise seems to come from up front. Maybe it's through the speakers, I'm not sure, but I drove a Sport Turismo with this engine, but not a hybrid. And unless it's just my ears playing up in my old age, the sound the exhaust seemed to make came from the exhaust, as bizarrely as that sounds. Whereas in this car, it sounds like exhaust noise, but it comes from up front, which is rather peculiar. I also drove a 4S petrol version, which with a sports exhaust, which sounded really rather lovely, and that to me is a key point. I do wonder whether Porsche prefer you to specify, or at least try to tempt you into specifying a sports exhaust in order to release some of the noise these engines want to make. In terms of ride and handling, there's a key difference there over the 970 generation car. Both these vehicles are very heavy. You wouldn't call them lithe. The 970 seems to handle through the benefits of sheer mass. It's 2.1 tons, of course, 300 kilograms of battery pack over the rear axle helps the traction enormously. That car is quite good in the snow, for example, despite its 295 rears. But it seems to go around corners just because of the sheer size and density and mass of the thing. The new one, despite its four-wheel drive, or maybe because of it, just seems a bit more fleeter of foot. We're up to speed now along a country road doing 54 miles an hour on a 60, and it doesn't seem to be quite as pinned to the tarmac. It's difficult to describe. You don't get the sense that it feels like a heavy car. It somehow feels a little more fleet of foot than the old car. It may even be a kilo or two heavier than the old car, but it really doesn't feel it. I mentioned the ride quality. This car is running on 21-inch rims, which look epic, incidentally, also wearing 315 tyres. And the ride quality is phenomenal. Running in sport mode currently, we'll describe the different modes and hybrid system in a short while. And the ride in sport is perfectly acceptable. In comfort, it's really very supple. The ride in the old car, 970, especially in Sports Plus, can be really hard sometimes. It feels very, very stiff. The new car, even in Sports Plus, is really acceptable, and the ride quality seems to be one of those areas they've really improved very well. One of the benefits of driving a Panamera, I find, is it's almost completely impervious to crosswinds, standing water, or a lot of hazards that would cause other vehicles all kinds of problems. And even on such wide tyres, this one, perhaps because it's four-wheel drive, cuts through standing water with disdain. And yeah, long distance crosswinds don't affect it at all. They're very relaxing vehicles to drive. You might have picked up a little noise there in the background. This one has the full gambit of driver aids, although it lacks the blind spot monitor, which I'd actually prefer over some of the other tech it has. But it's got the radar guided cruise control, the lane keeping assist. The lane keeping assist I'm not all that keen on. This business of taking your hands off the wheel, to me, I'm not sure the police would approve of that, to be perfectly frank. But the radar guided cruise, I've not driven a car that had such good radar guided cruise control since my last BMW. It was about 3 years ago. And okay, a lot can happen in 3 years in terms of tech improving, but it is very clear to me that the radar guided cruise in this car is very effective on motorways, in traffic, through towns and villages. You can set the distance to the car in front, and it's very relaxing then to commute in the morning. It's a real benefit to have, actually. So let's talk about the hybrid system then. So the hybrid system in the old car, to me, bizarrely given what the car's remit is its biggest failing. And I don't mean in terms of reliability either. Those days are kind of past, really. I'm referring to how the system is implemented, how the system actually functions. Now, I don't charge my car up anymore. It's too much of a faff in the evening, especially as we are now in autumn coming into winter. The last thing I want to do when I get home is get out of the car and go plug it in. And I think until we have inductive charging mats, where you just park the car, get out and it starts to charge, even with the presence of wall boxes, you've still got to physically plug it in. And the first world problem, I just can't be bothered anymore, to be honest. And I've not plugged this one in since I've had it from Porsche either. So my car's gone from doing an easy low to mid 40s on this 19-mile commute, and obviously return in the evening on a daily basis, to doing something like mid to low 30s. This one, over 2,500 miles in the hands of Porsche, has averaged 28 miles per gallon, which isn't very good in isolation. But of course, people don't really buy these cars for the economy per se. They buy them for the minimal road fund license, or indeed non-existent road fund license. There's nothing to tax these cars for a year. There's no congestion charge, of course, and there's other benefits to driving a hybrid. But if we get away from the financial argument for a moment, I want to talk about how the hybrid system in this one is actually integrated, because it's far better resolved than the old car. So in the morning, in the old car, I'll leave the house, drive the car off the drive, and I'll think, did I actually lock the door or not? Can't recall. So I'll park the car, step from the car for maybe 15, 20 seconds, get back in the car, and in that intervening 20 seconds, the car's basically switched itself off if the engine's not running. So you have to switch the key off, restart everything, reset the heated seats, reset the radio, reset the climate control, etc., etc. And it's just a bit annoying because the engine can't be controlled by the driver, and the hybrid system always has the upper hand. The hybrid system will always want to try and function. Whereas in the new car, you could actively select, there you go, when the engine comes on, with this little switch down here basically. There's other ways of doing it, I think, within the e-charge and e-hold screens within the hybrid menu, but I've kind of left that alone, because if you drive with a drive mode control switch in sport, the battery charges quite a lot actually, and then when you get to a town as we are now, you select hybrid and you can glide through a little village like this just on battery power. And of course the old car does that as well, but yeah, with this new one you can select via this switch when the engine runs and when it doesn't run. So with this switch, with the transmission, with the switch in S for sport, you can even turn the sport dampers off and just have the drivetrain in sport, and the engine will still run at traffic lights, for example. So it just seems better resolved, it seems less compromised, the hybrid system in the new car versus the old car. And I'll go as far as to say that, having declared previously I wouldn't have another hybrid because my view's been informed by what the old car kind of mandates, I would now have another one, because there aren't really any downsides. You don't feel the weight in this new one. The brake response and brake pedal feel is far better in the new one. The noise is far better, as we've discussed. And the hybrid system is better integrated. There's less compromises, and you don't really feel or think you're driving a hybrid. It's a lot more seamless. The technology blends into the experience far more successfully in this new car. In terms of practicality, one thing that is worth mentioning is the fact that the boot in this car seems a lot bigger than the old car. Well, not a lot bigger, but with the old car I can just about persuade the cliched bag of golf clubs in diagonally, but the depth of the boot floor doesn't seem to be quite as good as it should be. Of course, the battery pack is located under the boot floor, which raises the boot floor up a little bit, and you lose a bit of boot space compared to the normal, in quotes, Panameras. This new one, it's a little different, it would seem. The golf clubs fit a lot easier. It may be because the car seems to be a little bit wider. I'm not sure whether it actually is or not, but it's worth noting perhaps that even though it's fleeter of foot to drive, as I mentioned earlier, it seems harder to park somehow. That sounds quite strange, I know, but it seems to be a little wider when I use parking spaces all around Oxfordshire that I'm used to. So maybe the boot is a bit wider, which is why it seems easier, but the boot seems to be bigger in the newer car. But inside it's kind of the same really, that you don't want for space in here. It seats 4 full-size adults very successfully without any big issues at all. The storage space though is a bit lacking. The central bin down here, in the old car I can fit my wallet and 2 mobile phones in. In this one I can just about persuade my wallet to fit and nothing else. So there's not a lot of oddman space in here. 1 or 2 strange areas of change, not necessarily improvement over the old car, are bizarrely these cup holders. down here. The old car's cup holder by the driver's left elbow in right-hand drive cars, of course, is very poorly positioned and ideally located to go launching a cup of coffee across the passenger's lap every morning of the week. But the new one, the two here, they're better located. However, what we've lost is the panel under or in front of the passenger, where you press to drop down the panel, out of which then fold out two cup holders. They've never been the most ideally shaped and sized receptacles for bottles or cups or anything, really. They seem to be too small, but it was nice to have an additional option. So in summary then, 970 versus 971, old versus new. The new car is a triumph in my mind. It successfully blends hybrid drivetrain with internal combustion engine, where the old car does not. It improves upon an already gorgeous, well-built, comfortable interior. It introduces just the right amount of technology. What the car is capable of doing and how it goes about doing it, it forces other areas like these black panel displays here into the background. You don't notice it so much after a while. And overall, I've gone from a position of saying I wouldn't have another hybrid to admitting I could quite see the benefits of having one, because this car is not compromised by the hybrid drivetrain at all, whereas the old one is. So that's it, guys. We'll leave it there, I think. Thanks all for watching. Hit that like button, keep subscribing, and we'll see you all again very soon.